A successful businessman sees a familiar scar on a street urchin's hand and believes it could be the son he lost years ago. But as he uncovers the truth behind this encounter, he realizes his own past holds dangerous secrets he never imagined. Joaquin walks slowly through the park, breathing deeply in an attempt to release the stress accumulated over the past few days. The life of a successful businessman gave him a lot of satisfaction, but it also required sacrifices and left him exhausted. That day he decided to take a break, a necessary respite between meetings and important decisions. As he made his way along the tree-lined paths, he watched people come and go. Families enjoying a picnic, joggers passing by, couples walking hand in hand. It all seemed so normal and peaceful that Joaquin, for a moment, allowed himself to relax his shoulders and smile slightly. There was something comforting about the routine of others, about seeing how others led such ordinary, carefree lives. Suddenly, something caught his attention. A boy, no more than 10 years old, was standing a few meters away, selling candy to passers-by. It was not unusual to see children selling things in the park, but there was something about him that made Joaquin stop and look more closely. Maybe it was the way he kept his head down, or how he avoided eye contact with adults. Joaquin squinted, trying to catch some detail on the boy's face, but it was a scar on his hand that made him hold his breath. A small, almost imperceptible scar on the back of his right hand. His heart skipped a beat, and without quite knowing why, he felt a pang of anguish that left him motionless. That scar was painfully familiar to him. It was the same as the one his son had, who had disappeared years ago in an accident that had changed his life forever. Joaquin closed his eyes for a moment, remembering that fateful day, the desperation, the helplessness of not having been able to save his little boy. That pain had never disappeared, although he had learned to live with it, to hide it behind a facade of success. Unable to help himself, he approached the boy. Each step seemed eternal. Each moment filled him with a mixture of hope and fear. Could it be possible? Could it really be his son in some miraculous way? When he was a few steps away, he tried to gently get his attention. "Hey, what's your name?" he asked, his voice breaking with emotion. The boy glanced at him briefly, but his eyes only reflected distrust and nervousness. Without answering, he took a step back, and then another, like a frightened little animal that senses danger. Joaquin tried to get a little closer, raising a hand to reassure him, but the boy reacted quickly, turning and fleeing towards the park exit. "Wait!" Joaquin exclaimed, but his voice was swallowed by the noise of the place. The boy ran with agility, disappearing between the trees and the people. Translated from Spanish to English. www.onlinedoctranslator.com. Joaquin stood there, paralyzed, staring at the spot where the boy had been just seconds before. A wave of emotions washed over him, and he felt an emptiness in his chest that he couldn't fill. Was it possible that this boy was really his son? Or was he projecting his desires and his pain onto the stranger? Unable to resolve that mystery, Joaquin knew there was something he had to do. He had seen a sign, a glimmer of hope, and he couldn't ignore it. The image of the boy with the scar kept haunting Joaquin's mind. That night he could hardly sleep, tossing and turning between memories and emotions that he thought he had buried years ago. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boy running away, with that expression of fear and distrust that had left him bewildered. The next morning, Joaquin returned to the park, hoping to find the boy again. He walked along the same paths, looking around every corner in the hope of seeing him appear. However, the boy seemed to have vanished. The following days, Joaquin returned to the park again and again, but the result was always the same. The boy was not there. The desire to see him again became a need that tormented him. The possibility that it was his lost son filled him with questions and doubts that made him question every detail of the accident years before. He remembered the pain he had felt upon receiving the news and how his life had fallen apart in an instant. But what if something had happened and he didn't know about it? What if somehow his son was still alive? Determined to get answers, Joaquin began to relive the memories of that tragic day. He recalled the accident in which his son had supposedly disappeared. He wondered if there was something he had missed, some detail he hadn't noticed amidst the chaos and grief. Had it been a mistake to blindly trust the official report? As the days passed, his anguish grew. The possibility that this child was really his son filled him with desperate longing, but also with deep fear. He could not bear the thought of having wasted so much time without knowing the truth. It was then that he decided that he had to do something more than just wait in the park. He needed a more active way to search for the child, to understand if there was any clue in his past life that could shed light on this new uncertainty. Joaquin began to investigate on his own. He called old acquaintances, reviewed files and documents he had saved from the time of the accident. As he delved deeper into those papers and testimonies, he revived details that had seemed vague to him, but which now took on a new meaning. He realized that he had never questioned anything, that he had simply accepted the version of events, blinded by pain. But something inside him told him he had to dig deeper. He couldn't stop thinking about the boy's face and the scar that reminded him so much of his son. That little detail had become an obsession that drove him to keep searching, although deep down he feared he was creating vain illusions. Renewed in his determination, Joaquin decided that he would visit key people from his past, especially those who were present during the time of the accident. There was something he felt he must uncover, a piece of information he needed to gather in order to clear up the mystery that now filled his life with uncertainty. Looking once more at the trees in the park, hoping to see the boy peeking through them, he took a deep breath. The possibility of being reunited with his son, of being able to get a second chance, kept him on edge. He had to move on. He had to find answers. Determined to get answers, Joaquin headed to the home of Carlos, an old friend and trusted partner who had been by his side during the toughest times of his life, including the fateful day he lost his son. Carlos was one of the few people who knew firsthand the pain Joaquin had experienced, and Joaquin thought that perhaps he could remember some detail that had gone unnoticed at the time. When he arrived, Carlos greeted him with surprise. It was not common for Joaquin to appear unannounced, and even less so with the intense and determined look he wore at that moment. After exchanging a few pleasantries, Joaquin got straight to the point. "Carlos, I need to talk to you about my son's accident," said Joaquin, his voice filled with a mixture of pain and hope. Carlos stared at him, and there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes as if the subject was uncomfortable or perhaps painful. He tried to change the subject, to talk about his family or work, but Joaquin insisted, knowing that Carlos was avoiding the conversation. "Please, Carlos," continued Joaquin, "this is important to me. I need to know if you remember anything, any detail from the day of the accident, something that perhaps we didn't notice at the time." Carlos sighed and sat down, as if the weight of the years had suddenly caught up with him. He seemed to be considering whether or not he should really speak. Finally, he began to relate what he remembered, although vaguely and without much detail. He spoke of the circumstances of the day, of how the news had arrived, and of the despair they had both shared. But the more he spoke, the more evasive he seemed, and Joaquin could not help but notice that his friend was constantly looking away. That attitude only increased Joaquin's doubts. Something didn't fit. He felt that Carlos was not being completely honest, and although he had never had any reason to doubt him, the way he avoided the subject was disturbing. There were details that he mentioned vaguely, as if he were trying not to commit to the version of events he was telling him. "Is there something you're hiding from me, Carlos?" Joaquin asked, looking at him with an intensity that left his friend speechless for a moment. Carlos looked down and shook his head, muttering that it had all been an accident, that there was nothing more to say. However, doubt had already been planted in Joaquin's heart. That conversation had only fueled his suspicions that something had not been as he had been told at the time. After an awkward silence, Joaquin said goodbye and left the house, feeling more confused than ever. As he walked through the streets, he began to relive old memories and question everything he had accepted as true. He began to think of all the little signs he had perhaps ignored, the details that now, in the light of this new search, seemed to take on another meaning. The conversation with Carlos had awakened something in him, a deep intuition that told him he had to keep investigating. Now he couldn't stay still. He knew he needed to go further, to look for answers where he hadn't looked before. Determined to continue, Joaquin understood that the path to the truth would not be easy, but he was willing to face it. There was something in that past that he needed to discover, something that, perhaps, would change his life forever. Joaquin couldn't ignore the uneasiness that had been tormenting him since his conversation with Carlos. He was sure that there was something that hadn't been told to him, and he felt more and more the need to discover the truth about what really happened that day. Remembering the last time he saw the boy in the park, he decided that his best option was to return to the area and talk to the local people. Maybe someone could give him information about him. He returned to the park and began to observe the passers-by carefully, looking for some clue. As he approached a group of people who usually gathered on the benches, he decided that it was time to ask. With a calm but determined voice, he spoke to an elderly man who was reading a newspaper. "Excuse me, sir, have you seen a child selling candy around here?" Joaquin asked, trying to sound casual. The man looked up, looked at him for a few seconds and nodded. "Yes, of course. That boy comes from time to time. He is a strange boy, very quiet. He hardly gets close to anyone. He just sells his sweets and leaves," she answered before returning her attention to the newspaper. Joaquin felt a small spark of hope. At least he had confirmation that the boy was known in the area. He continued to ask questions of other park residents, and with each conversation, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, albeit in a fragmented and confusing way. Some said the boy was elusive, never staying in one place for long. Others said he always carried a small backpack with him, as if he were ready to flee at any moment. He had no friends and, they said, seemed distrustful of everyone. However, one testimony in particular caught Joaquin's attention. A woman who worked selling soft drinks told him that the boy used to appear in the afternoons, and that he was always looking around, as if he was afraid of being recognized. She even mentioned that she had seen the boy talking quietly to someone older on one occasion, but that she had never been able to see that person's face. This detail sent a chill down Joaquin's spine. He couldn't help but imagine that perhaps someone else was involved in the boy's situation. As he listened to people, his hope grew. Everything indicated that the boy was leading a wandering life, almost invisible, as if he were trying to hide from something or someone. This possibility worried him, and at the same time, increased his determination to continue investigating. With the clues he had gathered, Joaquin began to map out a possible route the boy could be following. Based on the places he had been seen in the times mentioned, he tried to imagine a path the boy would take to avoid detection. As he walked through the areas near the park, he realized he might be closer to finding him than he had thought. Night began to fall and Joaquin, exhausted, decided that he would return the next day to continue the search. As he walked away from the park, he thought about how he had gone from being a simple observer to someone willing to do anything to discover the truth. Although he still had no concrete proof, the idea that this child could be his son filled every thought and every action. Crossing the dark streets, Joaquin promised himself that he would not rest until he found him and knew once and for all if that mysterious child was the son he had cried so much for. After days of tireless searching, Joaquin finally had a hunch as he passed by a plaza near the park. He stopped and scanned the place, hoping to see a familiar figure. And then among the comings and goings of people, he saw it. The boy was there, selling candy to those who passed by. Joaquin's heart was pounding. It was the same boy, the one with the scar, and now he was so close that he couldn't let him get away again. He took a deep breath and approached cautiously, trying not to scare him. He knew that any sudden movement could make the boy run away, so he kept his steps slow and his gaze kind. "Hi, kiddo," he greeted, trying to sound friendly and not showing the intensity of his emotions. "What's your name?" The boy looked up, surprised and a little suspicious, but he didn't run away immediately. He seemed to be sizing Joaquin up, as if trying to figure out whether he could trust him or not. After a few seconds of silence, he replied in a low voice, "Luke." The name echoed in Joaquin's mind, filling him with a strange mix of joy and sadness. It wasn't his son's name, but there was something in the boy's gaze that made him connected to his past. Determined not to miss this opportunity, Joaquin continued the conversation delicately, trying to create an atmosphere of trust. "Do you sell candy every day?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. Lucas nodded, keeping his eyes fixed on his products. It was obvious that he preferred to avoid eye contact, as if he were afraid that Joaquin could see past his facade. But Joaquin sensed something deeper, a kind of sadness and loneliness that touched him. he decided to try another approach. "You know, I had a son who also sold candy when he was little. He was a good kid," she said, watching the boy's reaction closely. Lucas looked up for a moment, surprised by the confession. But instead of answering, he returned his attention to his sweets, as if he didn't want to open up too much. Joaquin understood that gaining his trust would take time and that the boy's distrust was deeply rooted. With a calm smile, Joaquin took a coin from his pocket and bought a couple of candies. He didn't want to force an immediate connection, but rather create a small bond, something that would allow him to get closer to Lucas without him feeling threatened. As he took the candies, he gave him a warm look. "Thanks, Lucas. Maybe I'll see you around here another day," she said, without pressing him for more. Lucas nodded slightly and Joaquin said goodbye, walking away with the certainty that he had taken the first step. He knew that he couldn't rush things, that he had to be patient. Although his heart wanted to shout to the boy that he recognized him, that he suspected there was something between them, he understood that he had to gain his trust little by little. That night, as he recalled their brief encounter, Joaquin felt a small spark of hope. There was something about Lucas, a feeling he couldn't explain, but it convinced him he was on the right path. He couldn't say for sure that the boy was his son, but every conversation, every look they shared, brought him a little closer to the truth he so longed to discover. After that first encounter with Lucas, Joaquin felt even more determined to uncover the truth. The connection he had felt was real and deep, and he couldn't ignore the possibility that Lucas was, in fact, his lost son. In order to move forward, however, he needed more concrete answers, and he knew exactly who to turn to for them. He looked for Carlos again. This time, he wasn't willing to accept evasions or vague explanations. His instincts told him that Carlos knew more than he had admitted in their last conversation. Doubt and resentment at his friend's silence weighed on him more and more. If there really was something hidden, he wasn't willing to let it go. When Carlos opened the door, his expression showed surprise and concern at seeing Joaquin again. Without wasting any time, Joaquin faced him. "Carlos, I need you to be honest with me," she said, her voice firm and full of determination. "That boy I saw in the park, there's something about him that tells me he's my son. And you know something, right?" Carlos looked down, and Joaquin noticed how his friend avoided his gaze. An awkward silence took over the room before Carlos spoke in a low voice, as if every word weighed on him. "Joaquin, I didn't want you to find out this way. I was just trying to protect you. You and your son," she confessed, her voice breaking. The statement left Joaquin breathless. Finally, the pieces were starting to fit together, though pain and confusion were mingling in his mind. He sat down, his heart beating rapidly as Carlos continued. "That time, it wasn't an accident. I received threats against your family because of your business and conflicts at the time. I thought that if everyone believed that your son was dead, he would be safe," Carlos explained, his eyes full of regret. "It was a desperate decision, and I thought it was the best thing at the time." Joaquin could barely process what he was hearing. He felt a mixture of betrayal and relief at discovering the truth after so many years of pain and emptiness. Carlos had faked his son's death to protect him, and he, unwittingly, had lived immersed in a lie that destroyed him. "How could you do this to me, Carlos? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Joaquin asked in a bitter tone, full of sadness and contained fury. Carlos brought his hands to his face, showing a pain that seemed as deep as Joaquin's. "I thought it was the only way to protect him, Joaquin. I knew it would destroy you, but what choice did I have? There were dangerous people after you, and I was afraid he would pay the price. I hoped that one day things would change and you could meet him again." Joaquin felt each word penetrate his heart, tearing open old wounds and creating new ones. Although he could understand Carlos's reasons, he could not so easily forgive the pain and loneliness he had endured for years, believing his son was dead. The feeling of having wasted those years, of having lived with an emptiness that was impossible to fill, made him question whether it had really been the best thing. "Carlos, I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you, but now the only thing that matters is finding my son and making up for lost time," said Joaquin, not containing the bitterness in his voice. Carlos nodded, his eyes filled with guilt and sadness. "I understand, Joaquin. I'll do everything I can to help you." Carlos's revelation had left Joaquin in a state of confusion and bitterness. The truth was a mixture of relief and betrayal, and his mind was divided between the need to understand his friend's reasons and the pain of having been deceived. For days, he kept wondering if it had really been necessary for Carlos to separate him from his son in that way. Determined to get all the answers, Joaquin met with Carlos again. He wanted to understand how deep the problem was, what threats had justified such an extreme decision, and whether there was anything else that could put Lucas at risk. Carlos received him in his office, with a tense look full of resignation. Joaquin didn't waste any time and got straight to the point. "I want to know everything, Carlos. Every detail, every threat. I need to know why you thought it was necessary to fake my son's death," Joaquin demanded in a serious and determined tone. Carlos nodded slowly, aware that he could no longer avoid the truth. After a long sigh, he began to explain. "In those days, Joaquin, you were involved in risky business, in negotiations that made very powerful people uncomfortable. I received threats against your family, specifically your son. These people were willing to do anything to force you to abandon certain projects and contracts," said Carlos, remembering with pain the seriousness of the situation. Joaquin felt a pang in his chest when he heard those words. He remembered those conflicts and the financial difficulties, but he never imagined that the price to pay would be so high. He remained silent, processing the information while Carlos continued. "Faking your son's death was an extreme measure, I know. But at that moment, it was the only way out I saw. If he disappeared from their lives, if they believed he was dead, you would be free of those threats. I thought that, in that way, you could protect him," Carlos admitted with an expression of deep guilt. "But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you give me the option to decide?" Joaquin reproached, his eyes full of rage and pain. Carlos lowered his head, acknowledging that he had made a decision that was not his to make. "I thought it was the only way. You were overwhelmed, immersed in your own problems. I was afraid that if I told you, you would make a hasty decision and put your son in more danger," she explained, trying to justify her action. Joaquin brought his hands to his face, trying to process what he was hearing. Although he could understand his friend's motives, he felt that a part of him had been irreparably broken. Having lost all those years without his son, having gone through such deep mourning, was something he could hardly forgive. "I don't know if I'll ever understand it, Carlos, but right now the only thing that matters to me is being close to my son, to Lucas. Even if he doesn't know who I am, even if it means rebuilding a relationship from scratch, I don't want to waste any more time," said Joaquin, determined and firm. Carlos nodded, understanding his friend's determination. "I will do everything I can to help you, Joaquin, and I will do whatever it takes to correct my mistake," Carlos promised in a sincere and repentant tone. With his heart still torn between forgiveness and resentment, Joaquin left Carlos's office. His mind was clear. He had wasted too much time, and now he just wanted to get Lucas back. Although he knew the road would be difficult, he was willing to face it with everything he had. Joaquin, burdened by a mixture of emotions, knew that the next step would be to confront Lucas and open his heart to him. Carlos's revelation had given him the answers he was looking for, but it had also shown him the long road that lay ahead. He was aware that, to really get close to Lucas, he would need patience and sincerity. The boy had lived for years on the streets, distrustful and alone, and Joaquin understood that gaining his trust would be a slow and delicate process. He returned to the square where he had last seen Lucas. He found him there, selling his sweets as usual, his small figure hidden in a corner, trying to go unnoticed. Joaquin approached slowly, watching his step, and when he was beside him, he gave him a friendly smile. "Hi, Lucas," she said softly, hoping the boy wouldn't run away. Lucas glanced at him, recognizing him, but this time he didn't move. There was something in his expression that revealed curiosity and caution at the same time. Joaquin took this as a sign and decided to sit down on a nearby bench, not trying to get too close. He pulled a bag of candy out of his pocket and offered it to him. "Do you like them?" "I bought them on the way here, thinking that maybe you would like them," he commented, trying to break the ice. Lucas accepted the bag with a suspicious look, but his expression softened a little when he tried one of the sweets. Joaquin felt encouraged and took the opportunity to start a conversation. You know, I had a son a long time ago. He was very much like you, brave and strong, she said in a tone of voice full of nostalgia. Unfortunately, I lost him, or at least that's what I thought. But now I think I have a second chance to meet him. Lucas listened in silence, his face expressionless. Although his eyes showed a slight curiosity, Joaquin knew he couldn't force anything, so he continued calmly. I'd like to meet you, Lucas. I want you to know that I'm here for you and that you don't have to worry. I'm not going to ask you for anything that you don't want to give me. I just want you to give me the opportunity to be close to me. Lucas looked at him, and Joaquin could see in his gaze a hint of openness, though still laden with mistrust. He knew he couldn't expect immediate acceptance, but that small advance was enough for him. A few minutes passed in silence, and Joaquin decided he wouldn't force the issue. He knew Lucas was used to solitude and self-sufficiency, and that offering him support without invading his space would be the best way to get closer. Before saying goodbye, he pulled out a small card with his number on it and handed it to him. Here you go. If you ever need anything or want to talk, just call me. I promise to be here, he said, his voice warm and sincere. Lucas took the card, looking at it with a mixture of doubt and hope. He didn't say anything, but his eyes revealed that he was considering accepting the outstretched hand. Joaquin slowly stood up, saying goodbye with a calm smile. He knew he had taken a big step, and that, although the relationship with Lucas was still in its first and fragile stages, he had planted a seed of trust. The weight of the years apart still suffocated him, but he felt that, at least, he had begun to build something new. As he walked away, Joaquin felt a mix of relief and commitment. He knew Lucas had led a hard life, and that it would take much more than words to help him heal. But he was determined to be a constant presence in his life, to offer the support and love the boy had lost. For the first time in a long time, Joaquin felt like he was on the right path. With the initial bond with Lucas slowly being established, Joaquin understood that the time had come to resolve the shadows of his past that could still threaten his future. To ensure his son's safety, he had to confront the partners and enemies of those difficult years, those that led Carlos to make the extreme decision of faking his son's death. Joaquin began investigating who among his former partners were still active in business and what the real motives were behind the threats he had received. It was an arduous process, but the motivation to protect Lucas gave him strength. He needed to make sure that no danger remained latent. He first met with Raul, a partner with whom he had worked on several projects and who had ties to influential people. Joaquin recalled that Raul had always been ambitious, willing to do whatever it took to make a profit. Their meeting was tense, and Joaquin decided to be direct. I want to know who was behind those threats, said Joaquin, his voice firm, looking him straight in the eyes. Raul sighed, crossing his arms defensively. Joaquin, back then things were different. We didn't know how far the consequences of certain agreements would go. But if you insist on bringing up the past, I'll tell you that the threats didn't come from us, but from those who handled the money and wanted to protect their own interests, revealed Raul without a trace of regret. That conversation made Joaquin clearer about the forces that had threatened his family in the past. Raul and his partners had been only middlemen, and the real danger came from powerful and unscrupulous people, determined to eliminate any obstacle that stood in the way of their business. Determined to leave no loose ends, Joaquin also met with other contacts and gathered evidence to ensure that these threats remained in the past. He spoke to lawyers and made arrangements to legally protect Lucas and his new relationship. Each step gave him a sense of relief, as if he were ridding himself of the shadows that had haunted his life for years. One afternoon, while he was reviewing documents in his office, Carlos called him. He felt the need to inform him of the progress and confirm that, after all, the decision he had made years ago had allowed Lucas to survive in the midst of a hostile environment. Carlos, I want you to know that I have closed all pending matters. I made sure that no threat remains latent, and there is no longer any reason for Lucas to live in hiding, Joaquin informed him, with a mixture of gratitude and pain in his voice. Carlos listened in silence, relieved that the burden had finally disappeared. Joaquin, I'm so sorry, but I'm grateful that you found a way to close this cycle. I hope you can rebuild the relationship you both deserve. Carlos replied with a tone of sincere regret. After hanging up, Joaquin felt more prepared to move forward. By facing his own mistakes and the mistakes of others, he had done everything he could to ensure Lucas a peaceful life. Now the next step would be to dedicate his time and effort to building a future together. With a sense of peace he had never felt before, Joaquin knew he had finally faced all the ghosts of the past. He was ready to be the father Lucas needed, and although the process of rebuilding their bond would take time, he was committed to making every day count. After weeks of brief encounters and cautious conversations, Joaquin and Lucas had begun to forge a genuine connection. Every day, Joaquin found a new opportunity to get closer to him, to show him that his intentions were sincere and that he wanted to be a part of his life, no matter how long it took them to build that fragile trust. One afternoon, Joaquin invited Lucas to a quiet park, away from the hustle and bustle where he usually sold his sweets. Lucas, although still reluctant, accepted the invitation, perhaps feeling that that man who insisted so much on her company really wanted something more than just a chat. They sat on a bench in silence, watching the sun begin to set. Joaquin took a deep breath, knowing that the time had come to be honest about his past and his relationship with him. "Lucas, I want to tell you something important about me," Joaquin began, his voice soft and calm. "Many years ago, I thought I had lost someone very important in my life. It was a terrible blow, and since then, I have lived with an emptiness that I have not been able to fill." Lucas looked at him in silence but did not look away. There was a glimmer of understanding in his eyes, as if he were beginning to put things together, or as if, deep down, he already suspected part of the truth. "I never stopped thinking about that person," continued Joaquin. "And one day, unexpectedly, I saw a child selling candy in a park. That child had something special, a scar on his hand that reminded me so much of my lost son. I don't know how to explain it, but at that moment I felt like fate was giving me a second chance." Lucas took a deep breath and looked at his own hand, as if he was finally understanding what Joaquin was trying to tell him. The silence between them was deep but not uncomfortable. It was a space filled with understanding and repressed emotions. "You mean that I am that son?" Lucas asked, his voice trembling, barely a whisper. Joaquin nodded, his eyes filled with the tears he had tried to suppress for years. "Yes, Lucas, you are my son, and I have spent so much time looking for you. I thought I had lost you forever. But now that I have found you, I want to be here for you, whatever you need. I can't change what happened, but I want you to know that I will not fail you again." Lucas remained silent, processing Joaquin's words. His expression was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and deep sadness. He had lived his whole life without a family, believing he was alone in the world. And now this man was telling him that he had always been looking for him. "I don't know if I can trust so quickly," Lucas confessed, with a sincerity that tore at Joaquin's heart. "I've been alone for a long time. It's not easy for me to believe in someone." Joaquin looked at him with understanding and gave him a soft smile. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away, Lucas. I just want you to know that I'm not going to force you into anything. We can go slowly. You can take all the time you need," she replied with a firmness that reflected her commitment. Lucas nodded, saying nothing more. But at that moment, Joaquin felt that something had changed, a small spark of hope that he hadn't seen before. It was a first step, a sign that, despite the wounds and the difficult past, there was a chance to rebuild what had been lost. In the days that followed, they began to spend more time together, sharing little things that strengthened their relationship. Lucas was still reserved, but little by little he would let a smile show, a kind word, a show of affection that filled Joaquin's heart with joy and hope. Although the road would be long and they would have to face challenges to heal the wounds of the past, Joaquin and Lucas committed to being part of each other's lives. It was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild that broken bond, to forge a father-son relationship based on love, patience, and perseverance. For Joaquin, every day with Lucas was an opportunity to redeem himself and show him that, despite the lost time, he would always be there for him. And for Lucas, this newfound bond was a promise that, after so much pain and loneliness, he could finally begin to believe in a shared future with someone who loved him. In the end, Joaquin shows us that sometimes facing the secrets of the past is the only way to heal and build a future. His story teaches us that true strength lies in patience, forgiveness, and the will to repair the ties that time and pain have broken. And you, how would you have acted if you discovered that a loved one you thought was lost had actually lived nearby all this time? Would you forgive the person who hid the truth from you? Click on the video on the screen to follow this inspiring story of self-discovery and perseverance, and join us in this profound reflection on the power of love and reconciliation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the heart. See you in the next video.